All right,
Part three.
part three of the 10-part series. All right, yes, we're back. So here, I just want to go over a couple of things, talk about feelings in our brain, and again, there's a lot of pieces, but for tonight, just won't even talk extensive about them. But as you see, that we put experiences, choices, patterns, storage, fight or flight, and anxiety. And obviously, there's a lot more pieces that go on the brain. I mean, the brain it can get depressed. It can have a ton of more feelings, right? Like confusion, betrayal, feeling disrespected. List goes sad. The list goes on and on and on. But I brought these up specifically in the sense of kind of think of these as an umbrella, right? Where there's a lot of moving pieces under the umbrella, but these are kind of encompassed. So, like our experiences in life obviously have an impact on our brain. They can make good impacts or bad impacts. Out of our experiences, then we also have choices, right? We have autonomy, some level of autonomy, but we also have the ability to just make choices, and that kind of incorporates what we talked about just a little earlier with black and white versus abstract. There's lots of things that can influence our choices, right? In our emotions, apart from other things that can influence our choices, even other people's emotions, right? There's patterns. We talked about that a little bit in the subconscious, where there's patterns that they can be healthy patterns, they can be unhealthy patterns. And then there's storage, which we'll talk about a little bit later, in the sense of like the ability to store things. That can be a good process, that could be a challenging process, depending on what I'm storing or how much I'm storing. And then fight or flight, there's a level where a lot of times our experiences or the things that we encounter are going to create a reaction. So when we talked about brainstem, there's breathing, heart rate, temperature. Like sometimes I get very angry, and depending on the trigger situation. Sometimes I want to run. Sometimes I freeze up, right? And so it's a process where, I always think of like the example of sometimes we look at like, oh, if you don't fight, it's no good. If you don't fight, but this goes to abstract. There's things for each and everything, right? So like if I see a rabid dog running to me and I freeze up, I'm probably going to be in trouble. And now that might happen, but the reality is like hopefully there's a level where I'm also not going to fight it. My fight is to get on top of a vehicle or get away from it, right? So that can have an effect on our emotional intelligence. Like when, let's say we're having an interaction with somebody that's very challenging and it's triggering us, we're going to feel that we're going to either want to run from it or we're going to want to argue and fight back, right? And then I put anxiety, like I said, there's a range of emotions, but anxiety is definitely can be an emotion, but I think it also entails a lot more than it can entail a lot more than just emotion. That's why I put it on there, in the sense that stress, anxiety, we can feel on all different levels. There can be stress and anxiety from having to take an exam to, like a trigger point where it's like something happened. Some people have anxiety of going over bridges or whatever it may be. There's a range of things that can spark a whole level of anxiety. And I'm bringing all this in this piece because going back to emotional intelligence, it's like which we're going to get into tools and practical things in just a minute. Is that having tools and learning tools, because I think most of us, if not all of us, have heard the definition of like if I do the same thing over and over again, expecting the same result, that is a level of insanity, right? And so this is a practical presentation to say, okay, and it's humbling and it's hard to admit, but sometimes the way that we are doing things isn't working for us, and it's not working for those around us. And so if we genuinely want it to work, that means that some level of change is going to have to happen in the relationship and in the communication. And that's why we're talking about emotional intelligence, because I think that's the core and hub where change can happen. As I identify things, I can start to figure out how to do it differently. And I know there's a lot of factors that go into it, and trauma to deal with and stuff like that can be painful, which a little later we talk about. One of the practical things is to get some support, in some way, shape, or form, which we'll talk about. The second part of this is computer volcano soda bottle. This is something that has helped me to process and understand things in my world. And as I counsel and teach and instruct others, that like this is something that I think that we can all relate. We all know a computer, right? So kind of getting into the practical part is again, next time I'm going to show triggers, but there's a level when, let's talk about triggers for a minute, in the sense of everybody has a trigger. Trigger just being when something affects me in a way that stirs my emotions, right? I mean, it could be a good thing where like um you know I'm watching TV and I see that I win the lottery, right? Like, holy cow, that's awesome, right? Like, that's an amazing experience. I might even be overwhelmed and hyperventilate because I can't believe that I won, right? But what I'm presenting that is, on the flip side, is that there are also a lot of triggers that are struggle, right? Where we've had some type of trauma, we've had some type of um, uh, relational struggle that we've experienced, whether we've been in a hard dating relationship, a hard marriage, family dynamics growing up, right? Could be with a sibling, could we be with parents, could be with all the family, right? Could be contentious, and so we carry that into our adulthood. And if you think about it, a computer, it's a process. The computer is an amazing machine, and in today's society, I mean, we have things like we can go up to terabytes, right? So there's lots of storage space, but there's a level where even with a terabyte, there's a level where if I really work at it, I can fill it up. But most of us are dealing with gigabytes, and so it's a process that if I store too much on my computer, there's a level where at some point it's going to slow down, or on my phone, it's going to slow down in its operating capacity because I have too much on it. And so when it slows down, as humans, we get frustrated because it's not going the same speed and I need to do stuff. But if we think about that in our humanness, there's a level where we relate to that because our brain is kind of it's kind of a computer, right? So think about having a storage space where I'm putting all this information, saving all this information, and eventually, the older that we get and the more that we store, so at some point that storage space is going to fill up. And with the computer, when it stores up, the computer slows down. If it gets really bad, it will overheat, and if it gets even worse, it could crash. And so we can have that same experience as humans, is that when I talk about conscious and subconscious, I understand. I mean, I've done it in my life to avoid, to not deal with it. But I would say, even though it was a lot of work at some points, I wouldn't trade growing in emotional intelligence, because it's helped me to get to a point to deal with my triggers better and to communicate and verbalize my emotions better. And so when we think about a computer as our brain, there's a level where if it gets overfilled, that's usually what happens with a trigger, right? Things are building up, I'm handling, and all of a sudden, I've reached full capacity. I don't have any more storage space, but I need to store some more. Now it's overflowing, and now it's coming out as anger and yelling, and could be harsh words. It could be abusive words. It can operate in so many ways, and come out in so many ways. And so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Is like how do we understand triggers? How do we navigate through that better? And so, but I wanted to reflect that I think we can all relate some way to a computer, in the sense we understand how it operates in its basic capacities. And so the volcano piece is, and the soda bottle are kind of that process as well, right? I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay till I'm not okay, right? And so then, like a volcano, we erupt. And when we erupt, that's that creates damage for us, and that creates damage for those that we erupt around. And erupting is just like the verbal things that we say or do. Like, we might break stuff, we might uh, say harsh words, we might, sometimes it might be the opposite. We might shut down and not say anything and kind of abandon the person. That's also kind of very difficult to deal with. And so when we reach our capacity, and we can't handle it anymore, it usually doesn't come out well. And so then we're going to interact with each other not well. And then that creates more of a barrier. It breaks trust in relationship. It creates damage. And now that I've dug a deeper hole, it seems ominous. I'm looking up. It was a shallow hole, and now it's much deeper, and it's harder to get out of. And sometimes, yeah, then we get into a cycle where, like, it's too much to deal with, and then we shut down, or we avoid, or we get out of the relationship or run from the relationship, or on the flip side, we try to control in the relationship, right? All these things can come out of that. So again, going back to, this is why we're talking about emotional intelligence in the process of communication and relationship, because there's so many factors that influence and can impact and create wounds and damage. And so we want to create healing. One of the ways we can do that is, even before we deal with other people, is learning it for ourselves, and being emotional intelligent for ourselves to process the thoughts and feelings that we have. So with that said, this is one of my favorite analogies. It's okay if people listening don't like Spider-Man, don't know about Spider-Man, but I feel like in some way, a lot of us do have an understanding, especially as Marvel movies came out and all that stuff. But I say Spidey sense. If you don't know it, the Spidey sense tingles as you see the tingling around his head when danger is coming around, right? And so I always like to relate, whether it's to the youth, to the kids, or to the adults I work with. This is a relatable thing. Even if you don't care about Spider-Man, we probably have heard spider senses tingling at some point, right? So it's a level, because he's been around for a while. And so I want us to think of the Spidey sense as our emotions. And emotions are amazing, but they can be very difficult to navigate through. So we're going to take a little time to kind of process that a little bit. As you see 6 points here, there's key points to processing emotions, right? So after we get done with this, we're not going to master it, but I think these are some practical things to think through, and we're going to talk about some practical ways to do these things, right? But I want to refer to our emotions as Spidey senses that sometimes emotions can be very difficult. They can be overwhelming. And I think, like I said, we can relate that they're usually, especially if it's triggered, it can be messy. And so it's a process where, starting with ourselves first, it's a level when we have emotions. I get sometimes, from just being honest about it, we try to find coping tools that sometimes aren't healthy for us to deal with, right? We can sometimes drink to numb ourselves. We can, some people can do, they'll do drugs. Sometimes it doesn't have to be as extreme. Sometimes it could just be, I'll play video games for hours and hours because I don't want to deal with what I'm doing, going through. I watch TV or movies. The ultimate thing is, all those things are, there's different severities of it. They're to distract us from dealing with emotions because they can be overwhelming. But like I said, with the subconscious, this struggle is that, yes, it helps us to avoid it, but then it creates unhealthy patterns in us, and that creates a whole nother problem, right? So I really want to emphasize the importance of what we're going to talk about now, is that, as challenging as it is, it's important to embrace emotions, because if I don't embrace them and start figuring them out, they're still going to have a power over me in the subconscious, right? So whether I want them to, now they're like, let's say I drink alcohol to numb myself, to not think about my trauma. There's a level where, again, the emotion is still affecting me. I'm drinking, and now I'm hurting myself more in a lot of different ways, because I'm unwilling to deal with my emotions. So in the long run, I create more pain than it would have been to go through the pain of dealing with the emotion, right? And I know that's easier said than done. I don't want to make it sound so simple. I know that lots of us struggle with different things. I've had my own struggles, and so I don't want to make it sound so simple, but I just want to emphasize the comparison. So when we talk about Spidey sense as emotions, I think a core of emotional intelligence is that, you see in number one, is identifying, is what is going on, right? And so sometimes we already past the stage. I know what's going on. That's why I'm avoiding it. But I want to encourage that it's important to actually embrace it. And so I want to stop for a moment and say, there's different ways to embrace it. And I've journeyed through different ways. And sometimes I've tried to go full bore and deal with multiple things at the same time. And over the course of time, I've figured out what tools work for me. So it's a level where, I don't need to do as much anymore. But when I first started embracing emotions, I would journal. I would just get things out. And it was cathartic. It was a way of relieving, in some way, not resolving it fully, but getting out. I sometimes, for me, I would go run, I'd go walk, and while listening to music, I would, to get my mind off of it. And so what I'm saying is that when we embrace it, it doesn't mean we can't distract ourselves. I think there's this place where we need to distract ourselves and take a break, right? But if we keep running from it, it's going to continue to affect us in the negative way that it's been affecting us. And so we're going to keep doing that unhealthy pattern. And so there's other way, and I'm not promoting myself, but just counseling or support, having a friend to talk to, um, listening to podcasts. I mean, there's so many tools today that we can learn information from. Um, but having some level of support and not having to do it by yourself is a big thing. Now I know that references that can be scary. Like, can I trust the person? Whatnot. There's a lot of factors there. So I would say discern that, think through that in the sense of just don't go share with anybody, because if I share with this person, I already know that they're going to put all my information on Facebook the next day, right? So avoid that. Don't do that, right? But it could be getting professional help. It could, or if I have a friend that I trust, to be able to like talk about it, to get it off my chest, to deal with that's another way to cope, a healthier way to cope. But yeah, identifying it is big, because if I can identify, I can start to deal with it. And what I mean by that is, for example, I think I shared in the first session that like there's a level where I was getting angry for years, and I could feel the anger, but as I started searching my emotions, I started to understand that, wait, there's something underlying that's triggering my anger. And as I searched it, like I said before, I found that there were certain times where I felt like I was being disrespected, and in the way things were presented to me. And because I was always angry, I wasn't identifying that I was being disrespected. And so I couldn't deal with and communicate about disrespect because I was just always angry. And so I just worked on calming down, which was a good thing. It was a good start. But then as I journaled and I started getting things out and connecting dots, I started to see like, wait, there's an underlying, I'm feeling disrespected, or something would trigger where like, um, in some ways I was very unsupported when I was growing up. And that would be a trigger if I felt unsupported in my marriage or in other relationships. That would trigger me, and that would make me sad, or it would make me angry. And so learning, okay, the anger is the spidey sense. It's telling me something's going on. Clearly, I'm angry. So, yes, initially calming down is a good thing. Decompressing, doing the things that help me to breathe, doing breathing, running, doing something that distracts me to just decompress myself and calm down, because I can process better when I'm calm. It's a big first start, it's a place to start. But then it's starting to dig underneath, because every time there's anger or sadness, those spidey sense emotions, there's usually something going on underneath, and that's what we want to kind of dig and get to. And then that can be painful and that can be hard, but it can be also very freeing and powerful, because again, it's as I'm digging, I'm learning. Once I learn what's underneath the surface, once I learned there was disrespect and I felt unsupported, I could speak to that, right? And that, instead of like yelling or withdrawing or saying something hurtful or mean, now I could start to process and be like, okay, man, I really didn't like the way that person talked to me. I'm kind of afraid to confront, but I can understand, I can process and actually come up with what I want to say now, because I know that I'm feeling disrespected. And so let me think about what would I want to say to that person. And that takes time, but you see what I'm saying? That's emotional intelligence. That's a practical emotional intelligence in motion, where it's a process where I'm discovering what's there. That's a first step, identifying and understanding what's going on in the world. Like, I'm not even suggesting that we even have to go and communicate that yet. It's first just discovering it. Once I understand that, grows my emotional intelligence to be able to verbalize and communicate when I'm ready to do that, right? But discovering it for myself is a huge piece of emotional intelligence, identifying it and understanding what's underneath, right? And then I said distracting, because if I'm dealing with emotion, I used to like, okay, I'm going to deal with this. And I journal for a while and I process it. And I could be in it for hours sometimes, because I get focused, hyper focused on it. And then I realized that's kind of unhealthy, because then like that takes me away from other things the rest of the day. And so I learned a process of I identify, I process, I see where I can get to it. Even if it makes me upset or my chest gets heavy or tight, I'll keep pushing through. But then there's a point where I'm like, okay, I've done enough for today. I set a boundary and I take a break and I go do, I distract myself with something that I enjoy, music, to get my mind off of it. Sometimes it could take 5 minutes, sometimes it could take 30 minutes. I do what I need to do to distract myself, to refocus and move forward. And then at some point I'm going to come back to it, right? And that's why I journal, because then I could go back into a journal entry and see what was going on. And that's part of processing, right? I also mentioned support. in the sense of it's good to process on our own, but it's sometimes a lot more helpful. It's actually very important to process things on my own, but it's also very helpful to gain support, because sometimes I might get stuck and I can't see something. And if I reflect something to somebody, maybe they can see it from a different angle. So having support, a friend, a family member that I trust, or if I don't have that, yes, getting some professional help is always good. A counselor can help with that. And then forming a resolution. Those are, like I said, forming is kind of, now I identified and I understood what's under the surface. Now I can start to form what I want to say. Uh, and develop what I want to say and put the pieces together. And then resolution is actually dealing with it, right? Which is a whole nother aspect. Maybe we'll talk about that another time, of confrontation. But you want to move towards a resolution. Like the spidey sense went off and I go through this process. And in this process, like I said, each of us are different. Like me walking in the woods, some of you might not like woods. There's mosquitoes and snakes and different bugs, and it's hot out. And so like, it may look different for you, but you have to find what works for you, in the sense of like, it may be staying in an air conditioning house, but it might be cleaning something, while I process stuff. It may be, doing a puzzle. It might be doing, something that I can engage with, but like, I'm kind of distracting myself while I'm processing stuff. It could be journaling. I mean, you got to find what works for you. And it's okay that if it's sometimes, I mean, there were times I had 6 tools and sometimes I had to use all of them. Sometimes I only had to use 3, right? So that's spidey senses. We talked about triggers, learning coping skill, and what is underneath, as I talked about. The key to trigger is that it can be overwhelming depending on what that trigger is. And that's why I would say a big part of emotional intelligence is, if I'm triggered, yes, emotionally I want to like yell and shout, and this is much easier said than done, but it's a process of, I would say, one of the main things I've learned with emotional intelligence is that when I'm triggered, it's best possible, and it's okay if you have to yell, or I mean, I've recommended some clients get a punching bag. It's okay to be physical, but it's a level where what you want to do is ultimately slowly learn to train yourself to, before I deal with anything, let me de-escalate, right? I think that's a first key thing for emotional intelligence. Again, easier said than done sometimes, but I think if we think about that and process and recognize, okay, I don't even know where to start. Like, let me de-escalate, let me decompress, so that I do some things that help me calm down. And if I calm down, then I can deal with the situation better, right? There's so many factors that go with that, but I've learned that just working on calming down, I've worked on that. It took time, but I've worked on it. I'm working on my kids with it. And yeah, I get feedback. Like sometimes say, hey, do you think you should calm down? No, I want to talk about this now, right? And it's like, okay, I get that, but you know what, we can talk about right now. I guarantee it's not going to go well, right? And I can say that easily because I've worked on this for years and years and years. And so I admit, when I first started, it was not easy. It's like, when my trigger went off, I remember running up and down the stairs and like throwing something around the house, and my mind was just blown. Like, how can my wife say this to me or this way? And it's like, or she had her moments with me, and she's more like, she shuts down more, so she would withdraw for a couple of days and not talk to me. And it's like, we had our things, and it's like, I can laugh at it now, but at times it was just like, I can picture, and I'm like, man, what was going on? But it's just, I just didn't know how to deal with it. So it was just like, I'm so exasperated and upset about what's going on that I'm literally moving up and down the stairs and like huffing and puffing and making grunting noises, like I haven't evolved from being a caveman at all, right? So it's like, so it's a process that I can say easily now, just because I'm talking about, I just had my 18th anniversary, so it's just been a journey over the 18 years to really learn and grow in my own emotional intelligence, and it took time. It doesn't happen overnight, but I've learned that starting with the process of, if I'm triggered, let me go de-escalate. Especially if it involves somebody else. If maybe it's just, maybe I saw something that triggered me. it's good to de-escalate, but maybe if it's just my own thing, sometimes it's okay to stay in that emotion because to try to figure out a little bit. But when it's dealing in a relationship, like it's always often good to de-escalate, to calm down. And when I come back, it might flare up again. But the more that I train myself to de-escalate, that becomes a rhythm. And it doesn't mean I can't have my emotions, but then it helps me learn how to push through that and identify what's going on, like I talked before. So I think that's a big practical thing with emotional intelligence. It's like if something flares up, it doesn't mean to avoid it, but when I'm calm, then I can process it. Man, what was going on? Why did it trigger me so much? Why did I get what emotion was going on? Like what I just talked about. And that's what de-escalating and decompressing gets you to be in a better place to process what's going on. So with that said, and the last piece is one of the other major differences is translating feelings. And so this becomes complicated, especially if it's in a relationship of any type with like a man and a woman, because we are in our personalities, we are so different. And I'm aware that there are some guys who may be more feminine thinking and more women who are masculine thinking. So I don't want to isolate it just to the stereotypes, right? But what I am reflecting is that in some way, shape, or form, there are two major forms of thinking, right? There's a feminine and a masculine, and I say that because they're completely different from each other, right? So I know this can create confusion at some level, that it has for me, but it's a process that I think there are ways to understand it, that we're different, that we think and operate differently. So this was just another factor that affects dealing with our emotions and growing emotional intelligence. And so another time we could talk about that more, but I just wanted to reflect that. So yeah, in summary, I want to encourage three main things. One is when our triggers hit, to try to work on de-escalation so that I can get to a point where I can navigate through what's going on, right? Don't avoid it. Like de-escalation is not avoidance, it's to calm down so that I can deal with it and process it better. It's not so I can feel better and then just move on. It's process it and then and that will take time. And you, like I said, you journal, think through it, and then like I said, if it gets too much, and when I say too much, it's okay that I might be sweating or I feel overwhelmed or to some degree, but it's push at it, right? It's kind of like going to the gym. If I stay at 10 dumbbells my whole life, I'm not going to build the muscle, right? So it's developing and building the mental and emotional muscles to be able to handle with this. So de-escalating, processing, and then finding the tools that work for you. I mean, I share a lot, but those are kind of the three main components that I think about emotional intelligence from this presentation that I think really help in our communication with one another. It has to be done differently because if what we're doing isn't working, it has to be done differently. And what I'm sharing with you is some practical ways to do it differently. So yeah, thanks for having me. And hopefully that helps those who are listening. And if you hear it and you felt encouraged by it, share it with others, please.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, you had a lot of good points in there, and I hope you feel comfortable to come back other times
Yeah.
and share other wisdom, other things that are coming up for you. You know, certainly with parenting and mental health, we always endless topics, right?
Yes.
And sometimes things are shifting. So you know, we see it in our offices with our clients, how you know, that sometimes things shift as to what becomes more prevalent and what isn't. And, you know, emotional intelligence is one of those things that is always helpful. And we are often teaching our offices. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and for getting online with us. And we're very grateful to have you. Thank you so much.
Sweet. Thanks for having me. I'll talk to you all
Yep.
later. See you
All
later.
right. Have a great night, Daniel.
You too. Bye-bye.